good liar, like a really good liar. And I know that's probably not the best way to kick off a talk with a bunch of people who don't necessarily know me, but I promise I'm here to be honest with you. I'm the founder and CEO of a fashion tech company called Redenim based out of Austin, Texas. Our mission is pretty straightforward. We want you to get in our pants. And I love what I do, truly. But that wasn't always the case. In fact, the entirety of my career up to this point was predicated on a series of lies that I told myself. Lies about what I was entitled to, lies about what I thought success was supposed to look like, and worst of all, lies about what I thought happiness was. And that's not to say that I haven't had a pretty awesome career up to this point. I worked as a web developer on Wall Street, I worked in economic development, I worked in education, but it wasn't until I really got back to the basics and was honest with myself that I was able to find purpose and truly be happy. The first lie that I told myself occurred when I was working one of those college jobs at a popular clothing retailer in the mall. And I loved that job. I loved everything about it because it combined two of my absolute favorite things, working with people and fashion. And I worked there my junior and senior year of college, but as graduation started to creep up on me, I started to get this feeling like I had to go find a grown-up career job. One of those jobs with like a desk and like Microsoft Office pre-installed on a computer instead of pirated. And while I didn't necessarily know like what that job was going to look like, I got it in my head that I didn't have a choice because of that first lie that I told myself, that my retail job that I loved wasn't good enough. And yeah, it might not have been the right fit for me long term in terms of a career. There was no upward mobility, there were no benefits, you couldn't work full-time hours. But when I got it into my head that I was entitled to something more, I effectively dismissed all the parts of that job that I loved, that truly made me happy, even if they were silly things like helping people pick out outfits. And I'm sad to say that this wasn't the first or only time that I dismissed a job as not being good enough for obscure things, like it wasn't related to what I'd studied, or maybe I wasn't making enough money. And I know I sound really ungrateful for saying things like that, but I thought I could be honest with y'all. And because of that, I initially dismissed a lot of value from these early jobs. Things like learning how to code, learning how to navigate office politics, or realizing that my coworkers would become some of the closest people in my life. Things that would go on to help me as I founded my business. Things that would have allowed me to be truly happy if I'd allowed them to. And in looking back at these situations, I started to notice there's a huge, huge opportunity to recognize the things that are working, that are creating value, and that are making you happy. Be honest with yourself about what they are. Lean into them, no matter how small or random they may seem. Maybe you really like happy hours with your coworkers and you realize that company culture is more important to you than a huge paycheck. I have a friend who followed his passion to become a YouTube star because he loved video conferencing more than anything else in his job. Be honest with yourself about what's working, about what's creating value. Because once you identify those things, you can start to incorporate them into your life and your job. You just have to be able to recognize them and be willing to listen. The second lie that I told myself occurred around the same sort of personal era for me. Two things happened at the time. This was in 2008. Roughly 4 months after I graduated, the economy completely and epically collapsed. And this was around the same time that Facebook came into prevalence as a way to sort of like humble brag your accomplishments to other people, even if you kind of slightly inflated what they were. And I started to notice my friends were getting these awesome jobs like all around the country, or they were traveling to these exotic places, or they were coupling up and settling down. And I was doing okay, you know, not good, not bad. But I say that tongue-in-cheek because the reality is we were all struggling. We were competing with our parents' generation for jobs. We weren't traveling. We were going from couch to couch because we couldn't afford apartments or let alone homes. We were coupling up with the absolute wrong people because dual income was just like slightly better than single income, all while saddling, massive amounts of debt. But what we were all really good at was making it look like we had our lives together. And once again, I found myself entangled in this lie that was rattling around the back of my head, that my success had to look like everybody else's success in order to be real. And this belief led me down a lot of really, really bad rabbit holes that make me look like I'm incredibly susceptible to peer influence. But again, I thought I could be honest with you guys. The truth is, we're all guilty of this. We all compare ourselves to other people. We can't help it. So I'm not going to tell you to stop, because you can't. But I can tell you how to use these feelings to better yourself. Because the feelings of jealousy and inadequacy don't exist in a vacuum. They tell you something very important about yourself, and that is the things that you're most insecure about. And yeah, it sucks to sit down and think about the things that make you feel insecure. But that's the first step in being able to actually fix them. For example, I surround myself with a lot of very successful entrepreneurs. And whenever I feel compelled to compare myself, or that jealousy starts to sink in, my knee-jerk reaction is to be like, oh, I'm just jealous that they make more money than me. And I could leave it at that, and I could resent them for being rich. But if I take that feeling one step further to where I become accountable for it, the reality is it has nothing to do with money. I'm insecure about the fact that maybe I don't know if I can be successful as an entrepreneur. And it's really hard to admit that. It's hard to admit that in front of a room full of strangers. But it gives me a hell of a lot more to work with and things that I have control over than just playing the victim of circumstance and placing the burden of my feelings on somebody else. Getting into the practice of taking these feelings one step further to figure out where you become accountable for them is hard, but it's incredibly rewarding. I challenge you to stop thinking about and stop saying, how can I be like other people? Start to think about, how can I take accountability for my actions and my thoughts? How can I influence things that I actually have control over and start to break down my insecurities? The first step to this is being honest and acknowledging that they're there. One of the last lies that I told myself, and probably one of the most profoundly damaging, is one I hear people telling themselves all the time. I look back on my career, which spans, roughly 12 years. It's not super long. And I had it pretty good. I had a lot of really awesome jobs. I worked in a bunch of incredible cities. But I always had this sort of abstract, miserable feeling. I would say it's kind of like you have a really expensive, nice dress, but you're super uncomfortable wearing it because it's the wrong size. I was wearing this life that was good, but maybe didn't exactly fit me correctly. During the holidays in 2015, right before I founded my company, I was sitting with this sort of abstract, sad feeling. And in what would have been the Oscar-winning moment in the movie of my life, I looked at myself in the mirror and I said, is this what you want to be doing? And at the time, I was working as a web developer for an ed tech company in Austin, Texas. And things looked good on paper. I had a good paycheck. I had an awesome boss, amazing coworkers. But again, just sort of abstractly sad. In the hundreds of times that this scenario had played out before, I would fall back onto the same lie, that you have everything you want. You have everything you need. You have no right to be sad. And then I would be angry, or I would go sleep it off, or I'd go on like a mini bender. At one point, I started running so much, I ran marathons. And then I would just sort of continue on my life without changing anything. and these feelings would inevitably bubble back up to the surface. But not this time. For some reason, this time I answered myself honestly. I said, no, this isn't what I want to be doing for the rest of my life. I'm good at it, but I'm not happy. And that's heavy stuff. And then I had this feeling of overwhelming sadness. And I'm like, okay, let's take this one step further then. It's like, well, we're at it. And I asked myself, I'm like, well, you know, what would you do if you could do it all over again? And I said, fashion. I get into fashion. I love fashion. I loved that silly retail job that I'd worked 12 years prior. And that was the first time I'd ever been honest with myself about that in over a decade. And again, that feeling of sadness just swept over me. I felt like I'd wasted my education, maybe my entire career. There was no way at this point I could pivot into something else. I was stuck. So I understand why people don't have that conversation with themselves. It sucks. Sometimes it's easier to just keep on lying. Literally 72 hours later, in the most random and oddly specific way, this idea popped into my head for a tech-enabled fashion company. It came out of nowhere. That would later become the foundation of my company, Redenim, which actually combined a lot of things that I had learned with my love and passion for fashion. And I'm convinced that this idea came into my head in this random, novel way that I did because I had had that really hard, honest conversation with myself. Because I'd made space instead of continuing to perpetuate the lie that I had told myself dozens and dozens of times before that I had no right to be sad. And again, this is a lie that we most consistently tell ourselves, and it's one of the hardest ones to stop. Because sometimes when you're really honest with yourself about what makes you happy, it flies in the face of everything you've let yourself believe. Maybe it flies in the face of all the time you spent working or educating yourself. Maybe it flies in the face of a relationship that you think is everything. We don't want to feel like we're just sort of throwing in the towel on one phase of our lives to start another. But that's hardly the case, ever, is it? Because it's the culmination of these experiences up to the points that you find yourself having to have these honest conversations that allow you to truly embrace them and to be successful. Again, you just have to be willing to be honest with yourselves. I couldn't have started my company if it wasn't for all of the random little things that I took from jobs that I had determined weren't good enough for me. So I encourage you to take a critical look and find what is working for you in your life and figure out how to create happiness from that. I couldn't have started my company if I didn't take a cold, hard look at my own insecurities so that I could start to fix them and address them. And I challenge you to do the same thing, to look at your own insecurities, to acknowledge that you're there, that they're there, so you can start to actually break them down. And I certainly couldn't have founded my company if I didn't have that one honest conversation with myself about what truly made me happy. And so whatever path you end up going down, whether it's into entrepreneurship or a new career or hobby, or maybe you just find a way to look at what you're doing and find more value in it, it all starts with a few honest conversations with yourself. And I promised I wouldn't lie to you, and I stuck to that. And I hope now that you're able to find happiness, truly.